I give the call to the honourable member for Casey.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And over the course of the last hour or so, we have seen a chorus of congratulation for those opposite for the Treasurer's award given overnight by Euromoney magazine. A chorus of congratulations that not even they believe. A chorus of congratulations that the former Treasurer and former Prime Minister Paul Keating certainly does not believe. Because those over there know in their heart of hearts that this award is a joke. And the reason they are protesting so loudly is because they know that, and it confirms it in their actions. Now, we had the Manager of Government Business, who is known for his overstatement in this House, but I didn't think it would be matched by the previous Speaker, who said this award was entirely due to the Treasurer's actions and the Australian Labor Party. Now, the Australian economy is performing better than economies in Europe and North America because of the strength when we entered the global financial crisis. Yes. We entered that global financial crisis in the best possible shape. We entered it with our fiscal house more than in order. We ended with our fiscal house the best it had been in a generation. Now, the member who just spoke compared the Treasurer to Cadell Evans. I'd like to compare him to Cadell Evans too. You see, the Tour de France, and I am not, I've got to say, I'm not a cycling freak like some on this side of the House. My mode of travel is the car, I regret to say. But Cadell Evans rode for 3 weeks. He did the hard yards. And then, of course, as we know, at the end of the second last day, because he was in front, by convention he had won the race, and all he had to do was roll down the Champs-Elysees the next day. He just had to stay upright. Are you getting the picture? Wayne Swan is the kind of person that would hop on the bike for the last day and claim credit for winning the race. And that is the story of the Australian economy over the last 12 years. Now, if it was just that Euromoney magazine had looked at the Australian economy, saw a strong economy and made the mistake of assuming the current Treasurer had something to do with it, that would be bad enough. But it's actually much worse than that, Mr Deputy Speaker, because the Treasurer of this country did everything with his colleagues opposite to prevent Australia getting into the strongest possible fiscal shape. Let's make no mistake about it. Back in 1996, the Howard government inherited $96 billion of debt. $96 billion of debt, a $10 billion budget black hole, and an interest servicing cost on that debt of $8 billion every year. And it set about paying off that debt by returning the budget to surplus. It took hard and difficult decisions. Every single measure in every budget was opposed by those opposite and opposed vigorously by the member for Lilley. The member for Lilley, if he had had his way with those opposite in this parliament, would have continued on the road of debt and deficit. They would have continued, they would have had the new government continue with annual budget deficits, and they would have had that $96 billion net government debt continue to mushroom. That was their policy when they'd been in government, and it was their policy in opposition. And they opposed the Treasurer, Peter Costello, and the Prime Minister, John Howard, and all of the ministers every single step of the way. They opposed fiscal consolidation every step of the way. They opposed the sale of Telstra, the provisions of which were used to pay down a huge portion of that net government debt. And so by the time this member for Lilley became Treasurer, because everything he had stood for and everything he believed in had been successfully opposed by the government. In spite of him, he inherited the best fiscal position possible. Not only a budget in healthy surplus, where he was looking at $20 billion surpluses rolling down the line at him as far as the eye could see, and not only no net government debt, but as previous speakers have pointed out, $45 billion in the bank. And to give the Treasurer an award for the state of the Australian economy, which he had nothing to do with. In fact, if he had had his way, we would not be in this position, is like giving the prodigal son an award for fiscal restraint because he's only burned half the family's finances. That's the situation we find ourselves in today. Now, some of those opposite have mentioned Paul Keating and the fact he won the same award. I'll give Paul Keating this. He had done something in 1984 and 1985. He'd floated the dollar. He'd actually done something. Whereas this Treasurer, as the Shadow Treasurer pointed out, has never had a budget surplus. And even on the day this award is announced, he's wobbling on his promise of a budget surplus. He always has a promise of a budget surplus. It's just always moving further out into the future. He's always moving it further out into the future. And as the Shadow Treasurer pointed out in question time, this rock-solid promise has moved from an objective to an expectation, to a determination, to a plan, to a guiding principle, and then this morning the Treasurer said he'd give it his best shot. Now that's very worrying news because the Australian public know, and those opposite in their heart of hearts know, that the Treasurer's best shot is not good enough. No, and this small projected surplus that is now moving away from really sums up the Treasurer's complete economic and fiscal failure. Today we've had the IMF report released that the Shadow Treasurer went through in some detail. And confronted with forecasts of a more difficult situation, the Treasurer's response is to compound that difficulty with the introduction of a carbon tax and a mining tax. And if you just take the mining tax, which he plucked from the Henry Review, announced in the days before last year's budget, and has handcuffed pieces of expenditure to it. And you look at the fiscal responsibility of that when we've got record commodity prices, which everyone knows won't last forever. In fact, the real warning today is how just such a small decline in the terms of trade, indeed, as the Shadow Treasurer pointed out at the Press Club earlier this year, a decline of just 4% would plunge next year's budget into deficit. Just a small reduction in the terms of trade. But he uses these record high terms of trade to fund, through his mining tax, ongoing expenditure year after year. So when the revenue falls off, that expenditure will open up a hole in his budget. The Treasurer knows this. He knows that it's fiscally irresponsible. He knows that a mining tax, in the way he has put it forward, and he knows that that mining tax in every way, shape and form will not only harm the budget but harm our great economic strength. He knows that the carbon tax is going to make life economically difficult for Australia, acting ahead of the rest of the world. This Treasurer was not worthy of that award. Those opposite know it. Those opposite know it in their heart of hearts, and, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Australian public know it because they live with the consequences of his economic mismanagement.